The morning my son slid those papers across my table, he didn't say a word. He just watched me the way people watch someone they've already decided can't fight back. What he didn't know was that I had already read every page. And I had been ready for 11 months. The coffee was ready before the sun had fully decided to show up. That was how most of my mornings went on Monument Avenue. Quiet, unhurried, the kind of slow that Richmond does better than anywhere else in October. The light came through the kitchen window at a low angle, catching the steam from my mug, spreading across the old hardwood floor in long, pale strips. Outside, the oak trees had started turning, their leaves shifting to the color of worn copper. I had watched those trees change every autumn for nearly 40 years. They never rushed it. Neither did I. I stood at the counter holding my mug with both hands, not drinking, just letting the warmth settle into my palms. The kitchen smelled the way it always did in October: coffee, old wood, and something faint and sweet from the neighbor's apple tree just over the fence. Edward had loved that smell. He used to say it made the house feel like it was being held by something older and steadier than either of us. Edward had been gone for 6 years. But some mornings, in that kitchen, the distance felt shorter. I had just set my mug down when I heard the car pull into the driveway. I recognized the sound immediately, the way the engine cut off, the brief pause, the unhurried steps up the front walk. My son had his father's way of moving through the world, deliberate, measured, like every step had already been decided before it was taken. I used to find that quality admirable. Lately it made me careful. I didn't go to the door. I finished pouring my coffee, walked to the kitchen table, sat down, and waited. Some people go to meet what's coming. I have always preferred to let it come to me. The knock was 3 beats, firm and evenly spaced. Then the door opened. I had left it unlocked, as I always did, and my son stepped inside, followed closely by his wife. He was tall, like his father, with the same set jaw and the same habit of scanning a room before acknowledging the people in it. He was dressed more formally than a Saturday morning called for: pressed slacks, a collared shirt, a jacket that suggested he had something important to accomplish. His wife moved in just behind him, carrying a leather tote and wearing an expression I had come to recognize, something carefully arranged to look like concern. She was a woman who understood the power of presentation. Sharp eyes, a measured smile, a way of speaking that made everything sound like a favor she was doing you. In the beginning, I had liked her very much. That feeling had shifted over time, not in a single moment, but in the slow, accumulating way that clarity tends to arrive when you are paying close enough attention. "Good morning," my son said. He moved into the kitchen, the way he had been moving through this house lately, like a man assessing a space he was considering taking responsibility for. "Good morning," I replied. His wife set her tote on the counter near the door without asking. She smiled at me with that particular smile that always made me feel managed rather than greeted. "You look well," she added. I nodded and said, "Thank you for coming by." My son pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. His wife remained standing near the counter, close enough to be present, far enough to suggest she was simply there for support. I had seen that formation before, in rooms far more formal than my kitchen. It was not a coincidence. He reached into the tote and produced a folder. Thick, neatly bound, the kind that announces itself before it's opened. He placed it on the table between us and rested one hand on top, without opening it, the pause of a man who had rehearsed this moment. "Mom," he began, "we've been thinking a lot about you lately." I looked at him steadily. "I appreciate that," I said. "We want to make sure everything is in order," he continued. "For your future, for your protection." 3 words landed in that sentence: order, future, protection. In my experience, those 3 words appearing together rarely meant what they sounded like. They were the words people used when they had already decided something and needed the other person to feel included rather than subjected. His wife stepped forward slightly. "It's just some paperwork," she said, her voice smooth and even. "Nothing complicated. We want to make sure you're taken care of." I reached out and opened the folder. The documents inside were dense and carefully ordered. I recognized the structure immediately, not because I was guessing, but because I had spent 35 years teaching people exactly how documents like these worked, what they meant beneath the surface language, and how they could be used. I read the first page slowly, then the second. My son watched my hands the way people watch someone they expect to struggle. I did not struggle. When I finished the 6th page, I closed the folder and set it beside my mug. "I'd like a few days to review these properly," I said. My son glanced at his wife. Something passed between them that they believed I didn't catch. Of course, she said, after a beat too long. Take all the time you need. They didn't stay much longer. The conversation moved to lighter things, the weather, a neighbor's renovation, a restaurant they'd tried recently. But the folder sat between us on that table for the rest of the visit like a presence that hadn't introduced itself. When they finally stood to leave, my son paused at the kitchen doorway and looked back at me. The expression on his face wasn't guilt. It wasn't doubt. It was something closer to the look of a person who is committed to a direction and is no longer entirely sure the road leads where they expected. I walked them out, said goodbye warmly because whatever was happening between us, he was still my son, and that was not a small thing, and then I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I walked back to the kitchen, sat down, and looked at the folder still lying on the table. He had slid those papers across to me without looking at me once. I had picked up my coffee and said nothing. But I had already read every page. The first time I saw the house, it was spring. Not the tentative kind of spring that Richmond sometimes offers in March, where the warmth arrives for 2 days and then retreats like it changed its mind. This was late April, the real thing, dogwood trees in full bloom along the avenue, their white petals catching the afternoon light, the air carrying just enough warmth to make you believe the good season had finally decided to stay. Edward had parked the car half a block away because he wanted us to walk up to it. That was the kind of man he was. He believed that the way you arrived somewhere mattered. That first impressions were not just about what you saw, but about how you were standing when you saw it. We walked side by side down the sidewalk, and when the house came into view, a 3-story brick colonial with tall windows and a wide front porch, sitting back from the street behind an iron fence, he stopped walking and said nothing for a long moment. Well, he said finally, there it is. I looked at him instead of the house. He was smiling in that quiet way he had, the kind that never quite reached full expression but lived somewhere just behind the eyes. I had been married to him for 3 years by then, and I already understood that when Edward Whitfield looked at something that way, he was not just seeing what was in front of him, he was seeing what it could become. We bought it 6 weeks later. Those were full years, the kind that accumulate without announcing themselves. I was teaching at the University of Richmond by then, working my way through the ranks of the law faculty with the particular stubbornness of someone who had been told, more than once, that the path would be difficult. It was difficult. I did not find that surprising. Edward was building his own practice across town, taking on cases that other attorneys considered too complicated or not profitable enough. We were 2 people who had each chosen the harder road and somehow found each other on it. The house held all of it. Every late night, grading papers at the dining room table while Edward worked through briefs on the other side of the lamp. Every Saturday morning when we drove to estate sales and antique markets, not because we needed anything, but because Edward believed that beautiful things deserved to be in homes where they would actually be seen. That was how the collection began. Not as an investment, not as a statement, but as a habit of attention. A painting here, a sculpture there, a print from a gallery in a town we happened to be passing through. Each piece had a story. Edward always knew the story. He had an eye for things that were undervalued. It was the same instinct that made him a good attorney, the ability to see what something was really worth when everyone else had already decided. Over the years, the collection grew into something neither of us had fully planned. Pieces from Virginia artists, from traveling exhibitions, from private sales that came through connections he had quietly maintained for decades. By the time he retired, the walls of that house held work that had appreciated far beyond what we had ever imagined. But that was never the point. The point was always the story. I remember one evening, maybe 15 years into living in that house, standing in the front room with a glass of wine, while Edward straightened a canvas that had been hanging slightly off-center for a week. He adjusted it by a fraction of an inch, stepped back, looked at it, and said almost to himself some things only work because someone decided they were worth protecting. I thought he was talking about the painting. I am no longer certain he was. The illness arrived the way serious things sometimes do not, with drama, but with a quiet persistence that refused to be dismissed. Edward handled it the way he handled everything, practically, without self-pity, with his attention focused outward rather than inward. He kept working longer than his doctors recommended. He kept reading, kept corresponding with former colleagues, kept asking questions about cases I was working on, even when the effort of concentration cost him more than it once had. In the last year, he spent a great deal of time in his study. I did not always know what he was doing in there, and I did not ask. Edward had always maintained a layer of private thought that I had learned, over 4 decades of marriage, to respect rather than press against. He was not secretive by nature. He was simply a man who believed that some things were better given than explained. He passed on a Thursday evening in November, with the same quietness that had characterized most of his life. The house was still after that in a way that had nothing to do with sound. It was the stillness of a space that had been built around a presence and was now learning to hold its shape without it. In the weeks that followed, I moved through the rooms slowly, reacquainting myself with everything we had chosen together: the paintings, the shelves, the particular way the late afternoon light came through the tall windows in the front room and moved across the floor like something alive. I had lived in this house for nearly 4 decades, but grief has a way of making familiar places strange, and I was seeing it differently now, not as ours, but as mine. And then, one afternoon, I found myself standing in the front room looking at the collection, and I had a thought I could not entirely explain. The pieces were all exactly where they had always been. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed. And yet something about the way they hung there, steady, considered, each one exactly where Edward had decided it belonged, made me feel, for the first time since he passed, that I was not entirely alone in the house. That feeling did not make sense. I was a woman who had spent her career working with language and logic, and I knew that feelings did not have to make sense to be true. Edward was gone, but the house was still standing. And somehow, I understood that was not an accident. In the first years after Edward passed, Daniel was exactly the son I had raised him to be. He drove down from Northern Virginia every other weekend without being asked. He arrived with groceries I hadn't requested and spent Saturday afternoons doing the kind of quiet maintenance that houses on old streets constantly require: a loose gutter, a sticking door, a section of porch railing that had been soft for 2 seasons. He didn't announce these things or wait for thanks. He simply showed up, found what needed doing, and did it. We had never been the kind of mother and son who talked easily about feelings. That was not a failure. It was just our particular language. What we had instead was presence, reliability, the unspoken agreement that showing up meant something, and that showing up consistently meant everything. In those first 3 years, he honored that agreement without hesitation. He called every Sunday evening. Not long calls, 15 minutes, sometimes 20. We talked about the week, about work, about whatever was in the news. He asked about the neighbors, about the house, occasionally about pieces in the collection that he remembered from childhood. There was one painting in particular, a large landscape by a Virginia artist his father had found at a small gallery outside Charlottesville that Daniel had loved since he was a boy. He asked about it sometimes. "Just checking in," he would say, "making sure it's still there." I always told him it was. It always was. I first heard about Sandra on a Sunday call in the fall of his 4th year without his father. He mentioned her the way people mention things they have been holding for a while and are only now ready to release carefully, with a specific kind of casualness that isn't casual at all. "She works in finance," he said. "We've been seeing each other for a few months. I think you'd like her." I noted 2 things: that he had waited several months before telling me, and that he had framed it as a prediction rather than an invitation. I told him I looked forward to meeting her. I meant it. They came for Thanksgiving that year, the first holiday since Edward that felt like more than an obligation to observe. Sandra arrived at the door with a bottle of wine and a warmth that felt genuine in the moment, quick to laugh, interested in the house, full of questions about the artwork in a way that seemed appreciative rather than appraising. She was sharp and engaging, and I could see immediately why my son had been drawn to her. There was an energy about her, a forward momentum, the quality of someone who always knew where the conversation was heading before anyone else did. Daniel was lighter that day than I had seen him in years. He laughed more easily. He leaned toward her when she spoke. He looked, in the particular way that only love produces, like a man who had recently been reminded of something he'd forgotten about himself. They married the following June, a small ceremony in the Shenandoah Valley. I stood in the second row and watched my son say his vows with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and I felt something I can only describe as a complicated gladness, the kind that holds joy and uncertainty in the same hand without quite resolving either one. The changes afterward were not sudden. That is the important thing to understand. Nothing about what followed arrived all at once. It came the way water damage comes invisible at first, then noticeable, then undeniable, and by the time you can see it clearly, it has already been happening for a long time. The Sunday calls became shorter, then less frequent. Then they arrived on different days, as if the routine itself had been quietly renegotiated without my knowledge. When I mentioned it once lightly, without accusation, Daniel said they had just been busy. I accepted that. People are busy. Marriage changes rhythms. I knew that. The visits changed next. They still came, but the quality of the visits shifted in ways that were difficult to name precisely. Daniel moved through the house differently, less like a son returning to a familiar place, and more like a person conducting an inventory. His attention drifted toward practicalities in ways it never had before. Comments about the maintenance costs of older homes, observations about the neighborhood and how much it had changed, questions about whether I found the house difficult to manage on my own. Each comment taken alone was reasonable, thoughtful even, but I had spent my career working with language, and I knew that patterns were built from pieces that looked innocent in isolation. Sandra was present for most of these visits, and she had a particular skill I came to recognize over time. She could introduce an idea without appearing to introduce it, fold it into a conversation so smoothly that it seemed to have arrived on its own. She would mention something she'd read about estate planning, then move on before anyone could respond. She would ask about a piece in the collection with admiring curiosity, then make a casual observation about the market for that kind of work. She never pushed. She planted. I watched her do this with the patience of someone who had spent decades watching how arguments were built, not from the conclusion backward, but from the first quiet premise forward. Daniel, for his part, seemed unaware of the architecture. Or perhaps he was aware and had decided, for reasons I was not yet certain of, to trust it. That question sat with me through many of those visits, long after they had gone home and the house had returned to its ordinary quiet. There had been a time when my son brought his doubts to me the way he had once brought his homework, not for me to solve, but to think through together. A job decision, a difficult friendship, a question about something his father would have known how to answer. He had always trusted that I would tell him the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. That version of my son had been fading for about 18 months. The man who used to ask my opinions stopped asking altogether. I noticed. I said nothing. I waited. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday, which should have been my first indication that something had been planned. Daniel and Sandra did not typically host on weeknights. Their social rhythm ran on weekends, Saturday dinners with colleagues, Sunday afternoons that bled into early evenings. A Wednesday invitation, extended with unusual formality through a written note rather than a phone call, carried a different weight. Not wrong, exactly. Just deliberate in a way that ordinary dinners rarely are. I arrived at their home in the Fan District at 6:30. The house was warm, the table set with more care than a casual weeknight warranted cloth napkins, the good stemware, candles that had actually been lit rather than left as decoration. Sandra greeted me at the door with a glass of red wine already poured, as if she had timed my arrival to the minute. "You look tired," she said, which was not a greeting so much as an opening position. "I feel perfectly well," I replied, and stepped inside. The living room held one other guest, a man I had not been told to expect. He stood near the fireplace with a glass of wine, turning slightly as I entered mid-50s, silver-haired, dressed in the particular way of attorneys who have been practicing long enough to wear their confidence in the cut of their jacket. He smiled and extended his hand. "Franklin Webb," he said. "I've heard a great deal about you." I shook his hand and looked at him carefully. His name registered before his face did Franklin Webb, who had sat in the third row of my advanced legal theory seminar in the fall of 1993, who had written a thesis on coercive guardianship frameworks that I had graded with cautious praise, who had gone on to build a practice in estate law and elder financial planning in the Richmond area. I had not seen him in over 20 years. He did not appear to recognize me, or if he did, he gave no indication of it. "A family friend," Sandra said smoothly, appearing at my elbow. Franklin has been helping us think through some long-term planning questions. We thought it might be useful for everyone to connect. Everyone. Another word that sounded inclusive but functioned as a boundary. I said it was a pleasure, and I meant the part of it that related to gathering information. Dinner proceeded with the particular efficiency of a meal that has an agenda. The food was good. Sandra was a careful cook, but the conversation moved along channels that had clearly been prepared in advance. Franklin spoke about his work in measured, accessible terms, the way professionals speak when they are trying to make complex things sound simple without actually simplifying them. He used words like streamline and safeguard and transition planning. Each word was chosen the way furniture is chosen for a room to make the space feel natural and comfortable, and as if it had always been arranged that way. I had spent 35 years teaching students to hear what language was doing beneath what it was saying. I heard it clearly that evening. Sandra steered the conversation toward the art collection midway through the main course. She did it the way she did most things indirectly, through a story about a colleague whose elderly father had left behind an unorganized estate that had caused the family considerable difficulty. "Such a shame," she said, "when things aren't properly documented, when there's no clear plan in place." Franklin nodded with the gravity of a man confirming something he already knew. "It happens more often than people realize," he said, "especially with significant assets. Art collections in particular can be complicated to transfer. Valuation questions, provenance documentation, tax implications. Without the right structure in place, even well-intentioned families can find themselves in very difficult positions." He looked at me briefly as he said this, not pointedly, just enough. Daniel, to his credit, said very little throughout this portion of the conversation. He refilled wine glasses, asked Franklin about a mutual acquaintance, commented on a recent renovation project in the neighborhood. He was present but not leading. That, too, was information. After dinner, while Sandra cleared plates and Franklin excused himself briefly, I sat at the table and turned my wine glass slowly in my hands. The evening had been constructed with real skill. The setting, the guest, the sequence of topics, the gentle pressure applied through story rather than argument it was, I recognized, a well-executed first approach. The kind designed not to alarm, but to accustom, to make the idea of outside involvement feel like a natural next step rather than an intrusion. I thought about the word structure, which Franklin had used 3 times during dinner. In law, structure is never neutral. Structure determines who holds authority, who bears risk, and who benefits when things change. The question was never whether a structure existed. The question was always whose interests it served. When I got home that evening, I did not go directly to bed. I went to the small writing desk in the room off the upstairs hallway, a room I had used for correspondence and quiet work for decades, and I took out a fresh notebook. Dark blue cover, college ruled, the kind I had always preferred. I opened it to the first page and wrote the date at the top. Then I wrote Franklin Webb's name. Beneath it, I wrote the 3 words he had used most frequently: streamline, safeguard, transition. Beneath those, I wrote what I believed each one was actually intended to mean. Then I wrote Sandra's story about the colleague's father. And beneath that, one question: whose idea was tonight? I did not answer the question that evening. I didn't need to. The answer was already forming in the way that answers form when you have been trained to follow evidence rather than assumptions slowly, without rushing, with the particular patience of someone who knows that the first move in any calculated sequence is never the most revealing one. That would come later. I closed the notebook, placed it in the back of the desk drawer beneath a stack of old correspondence, and sat for a moment in the quiet of the upstairs room. Then I thought about Franklin Webb standing at that fireplace, extending his hand, telling me he had heard a great deal about me. I smiled at Franklin the way you smile at someone who doesn't yet know they've already said too much. I waited 4 days before calling her. Not because I was uncertain I had been certain since the drive home from that Wednesday dinner, when the pieces had arranged themselves into something too deliberate to dismiss. I waited because I wanted to be sure I was bringing her facts and not just impressions. Margaret Osei had no patience for impressions. She had built her entire career on the difference between what people felt and what they could prove, and she expected the same precision from the people she trusted. We had known each other for nearly 30 years, colleagues first, at the law faculty, Before Margaret left to build her own independent practice specializing in elder law and financial protection cases, she was the kind of attorney who never raised her voice in a courtroom because she never needed to. Her arguments were constructed with the kind of internal logic that didn't require volume. Judges paid attention to Margaret not because she demanded it, but because ignoring her tended to be costly. I called her on a Saturday morning from the small back porch off the second floor, a narrow space with 2 chairs and a view of the rear garden that Edward and I had used for quiet conversations for years. It felt like the right place for this one. She answered on the second ring. "Dorothy," she said. Her voice carried the particular warmth of someone who is genuinely glad to hear from you but is also already listening for what you haven't said yet. "I need your professional opinion on something," I told her. "Not as a friend, as an attorney." A brief pause. "Then tell me." I went through everything methodically, the way I would have presented a case not chronologically, but by pattern. Sandra's language over the past 18 months, the Wednesday dinner, Franklin Webb's presence and his carefully measured framing, the sequence of topics, the structure of the evening, the way the art collection had been introduced, not as a subject of admiration but as a problem requiring a solution. Daniel's particular silence throughout. When I finished, Margaret did not respond immediately. That was one of the things I had always respected about her. She did not fill silence with reassurance. She let it sit until she was ready to speak into it accurately. "What you're describing," she said finally, "has a name. It's called a coercive control trajectory. It's a pattern I've seen in elder financial exploitation cases more times than I'd like to count. The gradual repositioning of the subject, the language designed to suggest incapacity without stating it directly, the introduction of third-party professionals framed as helpers, the quiet building of a narrative that, by the time it reaches a legal setting, already has months of apparent evidence behind it." "I know what it is," I said. "I've written about it." "I know you have," she replied. "That's why I'm not wasting time explaining it to you. What I'm telling you is that what you're describing is not a possibility. It's already in motion." Her directness landed without surprise. I had expected it. What I had not expected was what came next. "You said Franklin Webb," she said, his name carrying a weight she didn't immediately explain. "I did," I confirmed. A pause, longer than her usual ones. "Franklin Webb and I have a history," she said. "Not a personal one, a professional one. I can't give you details, not yet, and not over the phone, but I want you to understand something. If Franklin Webb is involved in this, the situation is more structured than it might appear. He doesn't do casual work. When he shows up at a dinner table, there is already a document somewhere with your name on it." I absorbed that for a moment. Then I asked, "How advanced do you think this is?" "Advanced enough that you should not wait," she said. "Advanced enough that we need to begin building your position before they file anything. Because once something is filed, you are responding. And responding is always harder than preparing." "I understand," I said. "Good." She paused again, and when she continued, her tone shifted slightly, still precise, but with something else layered beneath it. "I want to mention one more thing. If this proceeds to a formal hearing, which I believe it will, the case would most likely be assigned to Judge Victoria Chen. She has presided over Chatham County for 11 years. I have appeared before her on 4 separate occasions." I had not heard the name before. "What's she like?" I asked. Margaret considered the question the way she considered most things, briefly but thoroughly. "She does not tolerate performance," she said. "She has no interest in how a case is presented. She wants to know what actually happened. That can work in your favor if your documentation is clean and your record is consistent. It can work against you if there are any gaps." "Then there won't be any gaps," I said. "Good," Margaret said again. "Then let's start now. Tell me everything you've written in that notebook." I reached for it. I had carried it downstairs with me when I came out to the porch, without consciously deciding to, and opened it to the first page. For the next 2 hours, Margaret and I went through every entry. She asked clarifying questions, flagged specific phrases Sandra had used, identified 3 separate instances that she said would constitute documented evidence of narrative construction if they held up under examination. She was thorough in the way that only people who genuinely understand the stakes of something can be thorough. When we finally finished, I set the notebook on the small table between the 2 chairs and looked out at the garden. The late morning light had moved across it while we talked, and the yard had that particular stillness of a Saturday when the rest of the street has somewhere to be, and you, for once, do not. "I'll draw up a preliminary framework this week," Margaret said. "Keep recording. Don't confront anyone. Don't change your routine. Let them believe everything is proceeding the way they planned." "I can do that," I said. "I know you can." She paused one final time. "Dorothy, I've handled a lot of these cases. Most of the people who come to me have already lost ground by the time they call. You haven't. That matters more than you might think." I thanked her and ended the call. I sat for a while after that, the notebook in my lap, the garden quiet below. I thought about what she had said about Franklin Webb, not the details she had withheld, but the weight behind them, the fact that she had paused before saying his name. There was something in Margaret's voice I hadn't heard before. Not urgency, not worry. Certainty. He called ahead this time, which told me he had been coached. The Franklin Webb I remembered from that Wednesday dinner had moved with the ease of a man accustomed to setting the terms of every room he entered. Showing up without warning would have suited him. The fact that he called 2 days in advance politely, briefly, framing the visit as a courtesy stop, meant someone had advised him to appear considerate. That someone, I suspected, had Sandra's particular instinct for presentation. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a gray suit that was one shade too formal for a residential visit. I had prepared for him the way you prepare for a performance you intend to let run its course. I wore a soft cardigan, moved slowly through the house when I let him in, and offered tea in a way that suggested I had all the time in the world and no particular agenda for any of it. "Come in," I said warmly. "It's so good of you to stop by." He stepped inside and did what people always do in that front hallway. He looked up. The ceilings in that house are 11 feet, original plaster, with a cornice detail that stops most visitors mid-step. Franklin was no exception. He paused, looked around, and let something appreciative cross his face that was only partly manufactured. "What a remarkable home," he said. "We've always thought so," I replied, and led him to the sitting room. He carried a slim briefcase, the kind that holds documents rather than a laptop. Intentional, I noted, suggesting paperwork rather than technology, something tangible that could be handed across a table. He set it beside his chair without opening it immediately. Another coached move. Let the conversation establish comfort before introducing the materials. We talked for several minutes about nothing in particular. The neighborhood, a recent gallery opening on Broad Street, the unseasonably warm weather for that time of year. Franklin was good at small talk, practiced, genuinely pleasant, the kind of conversationalist who made you feel like the subject of his full attention even when his attention was clearly elsewhere. I gave him every indication that I was charmed by it. Then, with the careful timing of someone who had rehearsed the transition, he reached for the briefcase. "I wanted to share some materials with you," he said. "Nothing urgent, just some frameworks that Daniel and I have been discussing, ways to think about long-term asset management that might give you some peace of mind." Peace of mind. I added it to the list of phrases I had been collecting. He produced a document 12 pages, bound with a binder clip, printed on firm paper stock that announced itself as official without being intimidating. He placed it on the low table between us and began explaining it in the measured, accessible tone he had used at dinner. Protective trust structures, designated management authority, provisions for continuity in the event of changed circumstances. I listened with my hands folded in my lap and my expression arranged into something I can only describe as attentive uncertainty, the look of a person who is trying to follow along and mostly succeeding. I asked the kinds of questions that sounded clarifying but were actually diagnostic. What does designated management mean in practice? Who would have access to what exactly? How are changed circumstances defined in the document? Franklin answered each question with patient precision, and in doing so revealed far more than he intended to. Because when you ask a lawyer to explain a document they believe you don't fully understand, they simplify. And simplification, in legal language, is where the actual intentions live. By the time he finished, I had a clear picture of what the document was designed to accomplish. The trust structure would shift effective control of the house and the financial accounts to a designated manager, Daniel, as primary, with Sandra named as secondary. The circumstances that would trigger this transfer were defined broadly enough to include outcomes that had nothing to do with incapacity. The provisions for my ongoing involvement were described in language that sounded participatory but was legally advisory at best. I thanked him sincerely for taking the time to walk me through it all. I said I would need a few days to read everything carefully before I could give it proper consideration. "Of course," he said, with the smile of a man who believed a few days was a formality. I walked him to the door, wished him a pleasant afternoon, and closed it behind him with exactly the right amount of unhurried warmth. Then I went directly to the telephone and called Margaret to tell her what had been in the document. A week after Franklin's visit, on a quiet Thursday morning, I sat at the writing desk, reviewing my financial records the way I had done every month for the past 4 decades, systematically, account by account, with the same attention I had once brought to legal briefs. It was habit, nothing more. Or so I believed until the 4th account. The transfer was small enough to overlook. $2,000 moved to an account number I did not recognize, on a date when I had been out of the house for most of the day. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I went back through the previous 3 months. There were 9 transfers in total, different amounts, irregular intervals. The kind of pattern that was designed to look like noise, rather than signals small enough to dismiss individually, significant when laid side by side. The account number appeared nowhere in my records. I ran it through a search using a financial database I had maintained access to through a former professional affiliation, and what came back stopped me completely. The account was registered offshore, held under a name I did not recognize but that shared a partial string of letters with Sandra's maiden name. It had received deposits from 3 separate sources over the past 11 months, mine being the most recent. I sat with that information for several minutes without moving. Then I printed everything, placed the pages in a plain envelope, and locked it in the fire safe in the upstairs closet, the one behind the winter coats, the one that had been there since Edward and I moved in, and that no one else in the world knew the combination to. Sandra had been careful, but careful people always leave one thing behind. Margaret came to me this time. She arrived on a Saturday morning with 2 cups of coffee from the place on Grove Avenue that she had been going to for 20 years, the kind of small loyalty that tells you everything about a person. She did not call ahead. She simply appeared at the front door at 9 o'clock, handed me a cup, and said, "I think we should talk in person." We sat in the dining room, which had better light at that hour than anywhere else in the house, the east-facing windows pulling in the morning in long, generous panels that moved slowly across the table as we talked. I had the envelope from the fire safe with me, already placed on the table before she arrived. Margaret looked at it without touching it, read what she needed to from the account numbers and transfer dates I had printed, and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "This changes the nature of what we're dealing with." "I know," I replied. She looked up. "They're not just trying to reposition your assets, Dorothy. If this is what it appears to be, Sandra has been operating outside the boundaries of what Daniel authorized. This isn't a family taking advantage of an aging parent. This is something with a separate legal exposure entirely." I had reached the same conclusion on Thursday night, but hearing it spoken aloud by someone whose judgment I trusted completely made it settle differently, more real, more urgent. "There's something else," I said. "Something I haven't told anyone." She waited. 2 years before Edward passed, he made a decision about the collection. He had it formally appraised, established full provenance documentation for every piece, and then, without telling me in advance, arranged a gift agreement with the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. The entire collection, held in the museum's permanent care, displayed under our family name, with a private covenant attached to the arrangement. Margaret set her coffee down slowly. "What kind of covenant?" I told her the general terms. Not everything. I did not yet know everything myself, but enough. Edward had attached conditions to the gift that I had only partially understood when his attorney first explained them to me after his passing. There were protections built into the covenant, specific protections involving the house and my legal standing, that would activate under circumstances I had not fully examined until recent weeks. Margaret was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said simply, "Edward knew." "Yes," I replied. "I believe he did." She left an hour later, with the printed transfers tucked into her own file and a look on her face that I recognized as the particular expression she wore when a case had just become significantly more interesting than it had initially appeared. After she was gone, I did not go back to the financial records or the notebook. I went upstairs to the room Edward had used as a study, not his working study, where the legal files and correspondence had been, but the smaller room at the end of the hall that he had kept for reading and for the kind of quiet thinking that required a door between itself and the rest of the house. I had changed very little in that room since he passed. His reading chair was still positioned the same way, angled slightly toward the window so the afternoon light came over the left shoulder the way he had always preferred. A few books remained on the small side table, chosen and then apparently forgotten, still marking the last things he had been thinking about in his final months. And in the top drawer of the writing table against the wall, beneath a leather-bound calendar he had used for 30 years, was the letter. His attorney had given it to me 11 months after the funeral standard practice for documents left to be delivered after a period of time had passed. I had read it once, that same evening, and then placed it back in the drawer. Some things arrive before you are ready for them. I had known, reading it the first time, that I was not ready. The grief was still too immediate, too shapeless. The words had moved through me without finding the places they were meant to reach. I pulled out the chair and sat down. The morning had turned fully bright by then, the light in that room falling the way it always had, patient, unhurried, like it had nowhere else to be. I took the letter out and opened it. Edward's handwriting was the kind that revealed the person angular, precise, each letter formed with the deliberate care of someone who had been trained in an earlier era to treat writing as a form of respect. The paper had the slight texture of something that had been handled and refolded more than once, though I knew I had only read it once before. Perhaps the paper itself remembered. He had written 3 pages. The first was personal, the kind of things a man writes when he knows there will not be another opportunity. The accumulated weight of a long life shared pressed into language that does not quite hold it but tries. He wrote about the house, about the collection and what it had meant to choose beautiful things together over so many years. He wrote about the quality of my mind, not as a compliment, but as a plain observation. The way you note a fact about a landscape you have lived inside for so long, it has become part of how you see everything else. The second page was practical. He outlined the covenant in clearer terms than his attorney had used, walking through the specific protections with the same methodical care he had brought to everything he had ever built. He had anticipated, with a precision I could only call love, the kinds of pressures that might arrive after he was gone, not with bitterness, not with suspicion of any specific person, simply with the understanding, drawn from a long career in law and a longer one in living, that what you build in your lifetime requires structure to outlast you. The third page was short, 4 sentences. He had written them in slightly larger letters than the rest, as if he had understood they might need to be read from a greater distance than 2 pages away. I will not always be there to stand between you and what comes, but I have tried to make sure that what I leave behind stands in my place. Trust the structure. Trust yourself. I sat with those 4 sentences for a long time. The morning moved around me, the light shifting, the old house doing what old houses do, holding its shape quietly, without announcement, the way things do when they were built to last. I folded Edward's letter carefully and placed it back where it had always been. Some things don't need to be explained. They just need to be found at the right time. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, and it was not addressed to me. It was addressed to my son, Daniel Whitfield, care of my home address on Monument Avenue. That detail alone told me everything I needed to know about the level of planning involved. Someone had decided that my address was now interchangeable with my son's. Someone had decided, without asking, that the boundary between his affairs and mine had already been dissolved. I set the envelope on the side table in the front room and waited for Daniel to call. He called that same evening, which confirmed he had been expecting it. His voice carried a particular kind of careful, the kind people use when they have rehearsed what they intend to say, but are still not entirely sure how to say it. He told me that a doctor had reviewed some materials, a preliminary wellness assessment, he called it. He said the doctor had some recommendations. He said the word recommendations the way people say it when they actually mean conclusions. I asked who the doctor was. He gave me a name, Dr. Harlan Moss. He offered the name quickly, the way you offer something you expect to go unquestioned. A psychological evaluator, Daniel said. Someone with experience in senior cognitive assessments. He said the phrase senior cognitive assessments in a tone that was meant to sound routine. I wrote the name down on the notepad I kept near the telephone. 2 words, Harlan Moss. I underlined them once. I said I would take a look at the materials when they arrived. Daniel sounded relieved, which told me he had expected resistance. The fact that I gave him none unsettled him more than an argument would have. 3 days later, a folder came by courier. Inside was a 12-page document bearing the name Harlan Moss, Ph.D., along with a Richmond address I did not recognize, and an institutional affiliation listed as the Mid-Atlantic Center for Cognitive Health. I had spent 35 years in legal academia. I knew how to read a credential line. I also knew how to verify one. The report itself was written in the kind of language designed to sound clinical without being specific. Phrases like mild indicators of executive decline and difficulty sustaining complex reasoning under social pressure appeared in the second section. The sourcing was vague. The methodology was thinner than anything I had required from a first-year student. There were no raw scores, no standardized instrument references, no co-evaluator signatures. Just conclusions, written in confident passive voice, attributed to a man whose name I had never encountered in 35 years of working inside the legal and academic systems of this state. I called Margaret that evening. Not from the front room, from the small study off the hallway, with the door closed and the light turned low. I did not want the house to feel the weight of what I was about to say. I read Margaret the name. There was a pause on her end, not the pause of someone searching their memory, but the pause of someone deciding how much to say. She asked me to read the institutional affiliation again. I did. She told me to hold on. I heard the sound of a chair, then the soft percussion of a keyboard, then silence. Then she said, very quietly, that she recognized the name. She did not elaborate. She said she would need to make a call before she said anything further. She said, use the word careful going forward. She said it the way people say something when they mean it, as a warning and a reassurance at once. I told her I understood. After we ended the call, I sat in the small study for a long while. The report was on the desk in front of me, its pages fanned slightly from where I had set it down. I had read enough fabricated documents in my career to know the difference between a report that had been written to evaluate and a report that had been written to conclude. This one had never been an evaluation. It had been a construction. Someone had handed a man a set of desired outcomes and asked him to build language around them. The following week, Daniel called again. This time, Sandra was on the line as well. They explained that given Dr. Moss's preliminary findings, they felt it would be appropriate to arrange 3 independent assessments: cognitive function, daily living capacity, and financial decision-making competency, each one administered by a separate provider. Each one, they assured me, entirely objective. I listened to the full explanation without interrupting. I asked which providers had been selected. Daniel named 3 offices, all within the Richmond metro area. I noted each name without comment. I asked when the appointments were scheduled. He gave me the dates. I told him I would be there. Sandra said she was glad I was being cooperative. The word cooperative landed with a particular weight. It is the word people use for someone they have already decided cannot think for themselves. Someone who, by agreeing, confirms the narrative rather than challenges it. I thanked them both for keeping me informed. I ended the call. Then I opened the notepad again, turned to a fresh page, and wrote 3 names across the top. Below each one, I drew a clean, straight line. There was more to learn about each of those providers. There was more to learn about Dr. Harlan Moss. And there was something Margaret had recognized in that name, something she had not yet said out loud. I was in no hurry. The appointments were still 2 weeks away, and I had learned, over the course of a long career, that the most important preparation happens in the silence before anyone realizes you are preparing at all. They had chosen the wrong doctor, and they had no idea why that mattered. August was the quietest month I had known in years. Not peaceful. Quiet is not the same as peaceful, a distinction I had drawn for students many times in 35 years behind a lectern. Peaceful means the absence of threat. Quiet means the threat has simply stopped announcing itself. August felt like the second kind. The phone calls from Daniel slowed to once a week. Sandra's messages, which had grown frequent through the spring and summer, arrived less often and with less content. The 3 assessments had been completed. The reports had been submitted, presumably to wherever Franklin Webb directed them. And then nothing. I kept my routine. I walked in the mornings along the side streets off the main avenue, past the row houses with their wrought iron railings and window boxes going dormant for the season. I tended the garden in the evenings, mostly pulling up what summer had finished with. I read at night case law, mostly, and a biography of a federal appellate judge I had long admired. I cooked simple things and ate them at the dining table with a view of the backyard. I did not wait. Waiting implies uncertainty. I simply continued, because continuing is itself a form of preparation. September passed the same way. The calls stayed sparse. Daniel mentioned once that things were being finalized. He did not say what things. I did not ask. I noted the word finalized on a fresh sheet of paper I kept inside the cover of the book I was reading, not in any dramatic fashion, just the word, the date, and the time of the call. One line. Then I turned back to my chapter. The filing arrived on the 14th of October. It came by certified mail, which required a signature at the front door on a Wednesday morning. The carrier was young, efficient, and entirely indifferent to what he was delivering. He handed me the flat cardboard envelope, confirmed my name, and was back down the front steps before I had fully closed the door. I carried it to the dining table. I set it down, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, not coffee, not tea, just water, and came back. Then I opened it. The petition for guardianship was 43 pages long. It had been filed with the Richmond Circuit Court, Probate Division, under a case number that already existed on paper before I had known anything was coming. That alone told me how far in advance the process had been set in motion. The filing date was the 9th of October, 5 days before I received it. I read every page. I read the sections on alleged cognitive decline, each one drawing from the 3 assessments completed in late August and early September. I read the sections on financial mismanagement, which referenced decisions I had made regarding certain assets, without specifying which assets or on what basis the decisions were considered unwise. I read the section on the proposed guardian, which named Daniel as primary, and included a supplementary affidavit from Sandra outlining her qualifications to assist. I read Franklin Webb's name in the attorney of record line and noted the bar number listed beside it. I set the petition down after page 43, squared the pages, and put it back in the envelope. Then I called Margaret. She answered on the second ring. I told her it had arrived. She said she had been expecting the call. She asked if I had read the full document. I told her I had. She said good. Then she told me what she had been holding on to since she confirmed the case assignment 2 weeks prior. Judge Victoria Chen had drawn the case. Margaret had mentioned the judge's name before, briefly, in passing. Now she spoke with more precision. Judge Chen had served on the Richmond Circuit Court for 11 years. She had presided over more than 200 conservatorship and guardianship matters in that time. She had a reputation, Margaret said, for impatience with cases that arrived in her courtroom poorly constructed. She required full evidentiary disclosure, expected attorneys to meet a high standard of preparation, and had reversed 3 guardianship petitions in the past 4 years, on procedural grounds alone. She was not predisposed toward petitioners simply because they were family members. She was predisposed toward evidence. Margaret said one more thing. She said Judge Chen had a particular sensitivity to cases involving individuals with academic or professional credentials because she had encountered, more than once, petitions that had mistaken a person's age or widow status for a lack of competence. She had written about it, briefly, in a circuit court advisory note 3 years earlier. Margaret had the citation. I wrote it down. After we ended the call, I sat with the petition in front of me and thought about the distance between what the document claimed and what the record would show, 43 pages of conclusions, and on my side 11 months of documentation, an estate structure built by a careful man who had understood exactly what it was designed to protect, and a history with Franklin Webb that no one on that filing had thought to examine. I thought about the 9 days between now and the scheduled hearing date. 9 days was not a long time for most people. For me, it was more than sufficient. They had filed their petition in the 2nd week of October. The earliest documented entry in my notebook dated to the previous November, the week after that first dinner in the Fan District, when I had written 3 words at the top of a blank page and drawn a single line beneath them. I had been ready for 11 months. They had been preparing for 6 weeks. I had decided what to wear 3 days before the hearing. Not because I am the kind of person who plans outfits in advance, I am not, as a rule, but because I understood that a courtroom is also a room where people form impressions before a single word is spoken. I had taught that principle to law students for decades. I had no intention of forgetting it the one morning it applied directly to me. I chose a charcoal wool suit I had worn to deliver a keynote address at a symposium in Washington 11 years earlier. It was well made, properly fitted, and carried the kind of quiet authority that does not need to announce itself. Beneath it, a white blouse, simple and pressed, low heels, dark leather, practical, no jewelry except a single strand of pearls Edward had given me on our 20th anniversary. Not for sentiment or not only for sentiment, because pearls are the kind of thing a woman wears when she wants to be taken seriously without appearing to demand it. I was dressed and at the front door by 7:45. Margaret arrived at 8, precisely when she said she would. She looked at me for a moment when I opened the door, took in the suit, and gave a short, approving nod. She said, "Good." That was all. We did not need more than that. The drive took 18 minutes. We did not discuss strategy on the way. We had covered everything in the 3 meetings we had held over the previous week. What remained was execution, and execution does not improve with last-minute conversation. Margaret drove. I looked out the window at the October streets, the same city I had lived in for 40 years, wearing its autumn in the ordinary way cities do, indifferent to the particular weight of any given morning. The Richmond Circuit Courthouse stands on North 9th Street, a building that has seen more than a century of arguments, decisions, and reversals. I had been inside it many times over the years, always in a professional capacity as a consultant, as an expert witness, occasionally as an observer when a case touched on elder law issues I had written about. I had never walked into it as a petitioner's subject. The distinction was not lost on me. Margaret and I arrived at 8:37. We found the correct courtroom on the second floor, pushed open the heavy door, and stepped inside. The room was already more occupied than I had expected for that hour. The gallery held perhaps a dozen people attorneys, a court reporter arranging equipment near the bench, 2 clerks moving between the tables with practiced efficiency. Daniel and Sandra were seated at the petitioner's table to the left of the central aisle. Daniel was in a dark suit I had not seen before. He did not look up when we entered. Sandra did. Her gaze moved to me, then to Margaret, then back to the front of the room 3 seconds, measured and deliberate. Franklin Webb stood near the window to the right, speaking in a low voice with a younger associate I did not recognize. He was dressed well, as he always was, a navy suit, a pale tie, the kind of assembled presentation that communicates competence before a word is spoken. He glanced toward the door when we entered. Our eyes met briefly. He gave a polite, professionally neutral nod. I returned it with the same. Margaret and I took our seats at the respondent's table. She set her briefcase on the surface, opened it without haste, and began arranging the materials she had prepared, tabbed, ordered, precise. I set my own folder on the table and folded my hands on top of it. I did not open it. I already knew what was inside. At 9 o'clock exactly, a side door to the left of the raised bench opened, and Judge Victoria Chen entered the courtroom. The room shifted the way rooms shift, when someone with genuine authority walks into them, not dramatically, not with any particular sound or gesture, but with a change in the quality of attention. People sat slightly straighter. Conversations that had been continuing at low volume ceased. The court reporter's hands paused over the keys for a half-second before resuming. Judge Chen took her seat at the bench without ceremony. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s, with close-cropped dark hair and reading glasses that she had already placed on her face before she was fully seated. She opened the file in front of her, scanned the first page with the brisk efficiency of someone who had reviewed the contents the night before and was simply confirming memory, and then looked up at the room. Her gaze moved from the petitioner's table to ours, brief and equal, without particular weight given to either side. Then she looked down again and made a notation on the page. The clerk called the case. Judge Chen confirmed the appearances of counsel. She asked if all parties were present and was told that they were. Then she nodded once and said, "Mr. Webb, you may proceed." Franklin Webb rose from his chair, buttoned his jacket with a single motion, and moved to the podium at the center of the room. He set his materials down, adjusted them once, and looked up at the bench with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man who had choreographed every moment of what was about to happen, a man who had constructed his argument with care, selected his evidence with precision, and arrived at this morning fully persuaded that the outcome had already been determined. He began to speak. His opening was measured, his language clean. He framed the petition in terms of care and concern, of family responsibility, of a son's obligation to protect a mother who, the evidence would show, had begun to struggle with the ordinary demands of managing a life. He arranged his papers with the confidence of a man who had never lost a case he fully controlled. I had seen that confidence before from the other side of the room. Franklin had been speaking for approximately 14 minutes when he paused, reached into the second section of his materials, and produced a document I had not anticipated. He presented it to the clerk, who forwarded a copy to our table and one to the bench. I recognized the format before I read the heading: a motion, single-spaced, 4 pages, filed that morning under an emergency designation. The title read, "Motion to disqualify Respondents' Counsel on grounds of conflict of interest." Margaret received her copy without expression. I watched her read the first paragraph, then set the document flat on the table with the same deliberate stillness she might have used to set down a cup of coffee she had no intention of finishing. Franklin addressed the bench. He argued that Margaret Osei's long-standing personal relationship with Dorothy Whitfield, spanning, he said, more than 2 decades, rendered her incapable of providing objective legal representation in a matter requiring impartial analysis of the respondent's cognitive and functional capacities. He used the phrase structural bias twice. He used the word integrity once, in a sentence that was clearly designed to suggest the absence of it. Judge Chen listened without interrupting. When Franklin finished, she looked at our table. "Miss Osei," she said, "do you wish to respond?" Margaret stood. She straightened her jacket with one hand and addressed the bench in a voice that carried the particular steadiness of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment. She said she would like to propose an alternative arrangement, with the court's permission. Rather than contesting the characterization of her relationship with the respondent, she wished to request a change in her designation from counsel of record to expert witness, specifically in the area of coercive control patterns in guardianship proceedings. She noted that she held a published certification in elder law from the Virginia State Bar, had been qualified as an expert witness in 11 prior proceedings in the Commonwealth, and had co-authored 2 peer-reviewed studies on the use of psychological evaluations in contested guardianship cases. She said she was prepared to provide her curriculum vitae to the court immediately. She sat down. There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds. Then Judge Chen said, "Mr. Webb, any objection to Miss Osei being recognized as an expert witness in lieu of respondent's counsel?" Franklin's response came a half-beat slower than it should have. "Your Honor, the motion was filed to address the question of bias, not to—" "I understand the motion," Judge Chen said. "I'm asking whether you object to the proposed designation." Franklin looked at his associate. The associate looked at the table. Franklin looked back at the bench. "We would note our continuing objection for the record," he said. "Noted," said Judge Chen. "Miss Osei will be recognized as an expert witness. The motion to disqualify is denied. Respondent's new counsel of record will need to enter an appearance." She looked at Margaret. "I assume that has been arranged." Margaret said it had. A second attorney, a younger woman named Claire Sutton, whom Margaret had briefed over the previous week and who had been seated quietly in the gallery, rose from her seat, came forward, and entered her appearance at the respondent's table. The transition took less than 3 minutes. I watched Franklin return to his materials. Something in the set of his shoulders had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not already watching for it. But I had spent a career reading rooms, and I could see it. The morning had not gone the way he had drawn it. The 3 independent assessments were presented next. Margaret, now at the witness stand, addressed each one in sequence. She identified the standardized instruments each provider had used and compared them against the published norms for individuals with graduate-level education and sustained professional engagement. She noted that 2 of the 3 assessments had applied scoring benchmarks calibrated for a general adult population rather than the specific demographic subset that included individuals with advanced academic backgrounds, a well-documented variable in cognitive evaluation literature. The 3rd assessment, she said, had been administered under conditions that included a time constraint not disclosed in the report summary. Then she addressed the primary report, the one bearing the name of the evaluator Sandra had arranged. Margaret stated, without drama, that the evaluator held a license issued in the state of Maryland that had been placed on inactive status 18 months prior. She produced the verification record from the licensing board, entered it as an exhibit, and explained that under Virginia statute, A psychological evaluation submitted in a guardianship proceeding must be conducted by a licensed professional in active standing in the Commonwealth or an adjacent state under a reciprocity agreement. Marilyn's inactive status license did not meet that threshold. She said it plainly, in the same tone she might use to describe a filing deadline. Judge Chen asked Franklin if he wished to respond to the licensure question. Franklin said he had not been provided that information by the evaluator. Judge Chen made a notation. She said the primary report would be excluded from consideration pending further review. She said it without inflection, the way a judge says something that has already been decided. I did not allow myself any visible reaction. I kept my hands folded on the table in front of me. I looked at the bench, not at Daniel's side of the room, but I heard it. In the particular silence that followed Judge Chen's notation, the way Franklin's associate stopped writing, the way Sandra shifted in her chair by a degree or two, the way the room recalibrated around a fact it had not been expecting, I heard it clearly. The first crack appeared so quietly that only I could hear it. Judge Chen gave Franklin 3 minutes to reorganize his presentation after the primary report was excluded. He used all 3 of them. He conferred with his associate in a low voice, shuffled the remaining sections of his materials, and produced what appeared to be a revised argument built around the 2 surviving assessments. His posture had not collapsed. Franklin was too experienced for that, but the quality of his stillness had changed. Where before he had moved with the ease of someone working from a script he had memorized, he was now working from what remained after a portion of the script had been removed without warning. Judge Chen said, "Are you ready, Mr. Webb?" He said he was. He proceeded for approximately 6 more minutes, leaning now on the 2 assessments that had not been excluded and on the financial mismanagement claims in the original petition. He used careful, measured language. He did not overreach. But without the primary evaluation to anchor the cognitive argument, the remaining structure had less weight than it had been designed to carry, and I could hear that in the pacing of his sentences, the slight elongation of transitions, the extra clause inserted where a clean declarative would have served better. When he concluded, Judge Chen looked at our table. Claire Sutton rose. She was younger than Franklin by at least 15 years, with a precise manner and a voice that carried without effort across the width of the courtroom. She had dark hair pulled back from her face and wore a plain charcoal jacket, not the same shade as mine, but close enough that I noticed, and found it appropriate. She addressed the bench with the direct, unhurried manner of someone who had organized her materials in a particular order and intended to present them in exactly that order, without deviation. She said she wished to introduce financial documentation relevant to the question of who, in this proceeding, had demonstrated a pattern of irregular asset management. Franklin was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor, relevance." Judge Chen looked at Claire. "Counsel?" Claire said the documentation bore directly on the credibility of the petition and the motivations of the parties who had filed it. She said it would take less than 8 minutes to present. Judge Chen considered for a moment, then said, "I'll allow it. Proceed." Claire introduced 3 exhibits in sequence. The first was a set of transfer records from a joint account held in the names of Daniel and Sandra Whitfield, an account established 14 months after the death of Edward Whitfield and funded initially with assets Sandra had represented to Daniel as estate administrative fees. The second was a corresponding set of records from an offshore account registered in Sandra's name alone, showing a series of deposits that aligned, within a margin of days, with the transfers from the joint account. The third was a financial timeline Margaret had prepared, overlaying the transfer dates against the dates of Sandra's documented efforts to restrict Dorothy's access to her own financial records. The alignment was not subtle. It was the kind of pattern that, once placed on a page, required no additional commentary to be understood. Margaret, still at the witness stand, was asked by Claire to address the significance of the timeline. She did so without ornamentation. She said that in her professional experience, a coordinated pattern of asset redirection occurring simultaneously, with documented efforts to establish legal control over a family member, was consistent with a class of financial exploitation she had described in her published research. She did not use inflammatory language. She did not need to. Judge Chen had been reading the third exhibit while Margaret spoke. When Margaret finished, the judge set the page down and looked at Franklin. "Mr. Webb," she said, "the account in question, was your client aware of its existence at the time the petition was filed?" Franklin said, Your Honor, my client's financial arrangements are not the subject of this. I'm asking, Judge Chen said, whether your client was aware. There was a pause. Franklin said he would need to confer. Judge Chen said he had 2 minutes. During those 2 minutes, I did not look at Franklin or at the bench. I looked at Daniel. He was sitting very still. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. Not folded. Not moving, just flat. The way hands go when the body has stopped performing composure and is simply waiting for something to resolve. He was looking at the exhibit Claire had introduced, the third one, the timeline. He was reading the dates. And then he looked at Sandra. It was not a long look. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, something passed across his face that I had not seen there in 3 years. Not anger, not accusation, not the particular careful blankness he had worn since Sandra had begun shaping the contours of his expressions. What I saw was simpler and older than any of those things. It was the face of someone who has just understood that a question they had not thought to ask has had an answer all along. Sandra did not return his gaze. She was looking at the table, at a fixed point on its surface, with the concentrated stillness of someone who has decided that the best available option is to become as difficult to read as possible. Franklin completed his conference and informed the bench that his client had not been fully informed of all account details at the time of filing. Judge Chen made a notation. She did not comment. She asked Claire if she had additional exhibits. Claire said she had 2 more. Sandra adjusted the position of her pen on the table. A small motion, precise and controlled, but her hand, when she set the pen down, did not settle as steadily as it had before. The room understood before Sandra did that the case had just turned around. Claire's 2 remaining exhibits took 11 minutes to present. The fourth was a correspondence record, a sequence of written communications between Franklin Webb and a property development firm operating out of Northern Virginia, beginning 8 months before the guardianship petition was filed. The communications referenced, in terms that required no interpretation, the anticipated availability of a Monument Avenue property following the successful resolution of a pending legal matter. The fifth was a valuation document for that same property, commissioned by the development firm and dated 3 weeks before Daniel and Sandra had arrived at my kitchen table with their folder. When Claire sat down, the room was quiet in the particular way it goes quiet when people are processing something they did not expect to hear. Judge Chen reviewed the 5th exhibit for a long moment. Then she looked up and asked if Respondent's Counsel had anything further to submit at this stage of the proceedings. Claire said there was one additional matter. She looked at me. I stood up. It was not something I had announced in advance, not to Claire, not to Margaret, not in any of the preparation meetings we had held over the previous week. It was a decision I had made the night before, sitting with the petition and the accumulated record of the past 11 months, understanding that there was one thing only I could say, and that the moment to say it would be clear when it arrived. The moment had arrived. I addressed the bench directly. I said I wished to speak briefly to the court regarding the professional background of petitioner's counsel. Judge Chen looked at Franklin, then back at me. She said I could proceed. I said that Franklin Webb had submitted his thesis for the degree of Juris Doctor at the University of Richmond School of Law in the spring of 1993. The thesis title was Protective Structures in Elder Estate Law, Limitations and Reforms. It ran to 112 pages. The 3rd chapter, which addressed the ethical obligations of attorneys in guardianship proceedings, opened with a line that I had suggested during the review process. The law does not protect the vulnerable by accident. It does so by design, and only when the people who practice it choose to honor that design. I had suggested that line because I was the faculty advisor on the thesis. I paused for one breath. I said that I had also been the chair of the Academic Standards Committee that reviewed a separate matter involving Mr. Webb in the fall of that same year, a matter that had resulted in a formal notation in his academic file, a notation that had been sealed upon his graduation but that remained, under University Records Protocol, accessible to the court upon request. The room did not make a sound. I watched Franklin from the corner of my eye, the way you watch something you have been expecting without knowing exactly when it would arrive. He had been holding a pen above a legal pad when I began speaking. By the time I finished the 2nd sentence, the pen was resting on the pad without his hand on it. By the time I reached the 3rd chapter citation, his shoulders had dropped 1/4 of an inch, not a collapse, nothing so visible as that, but a release the way a structure settles when a load-bearing assumption has been removed. He knew the thesis. Of course he knew it. He had written every word of it under my guidance, submitted it with my signature on the cover sheet, and received a passing grade from a committee I had chaired. What he had not calculated, what none of them had calculated, when they assembled their petition and their assessments and their carefully worded exhibits, was that the woman at the respondents' table had been in that room with him 30 years ago, had read his arguments, had corrected his citations, had written, in the margin of his third chapter, a single note that he had incorporated into the final draft without alteration. He had built his career, in part, on the framework I had helped him construct. And he had walked into this courtroom and aimed that career at me. Judge Chen set down the exhibit she had been holding and looked across the bench. She said, "I'm sorry, did you say you were the faculty advisor on Mr. Webb's thesis?" I said I was. She said, "And you chaired the Academic Standards Committee that reviewed a matter involving Mr. Webb in 1993? I said I did. There was a pause. Judge Chen looked at Franklin. Franklin was looking at the surface of the table in front of him, with the expression of a man reconstructing, at high speed, every assumption that had guided him into the room that morning. Then Judge Chen looked back at me, and something shifted in her expression, not in formality, not warmth exactly, but a particular quality of recognition, the kind that passes between people who have spent their lives in the same rooms, reading the same kinds of documents, understanding the same kinds of stakes. She said, "Professor Whitfield?" I said, "Yes, Your Honor." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she made a notation on the page in front of her, the third notation she had made that morning, and each one had moved the proceeding a degree further from the direction Franklin had intended. I sat back down. Margaret, to my right, did not move or speak. Claire, beside her, kept her eyes on the bench. Across the aisle, I could see Daniel, his head turned slightly, looking at me with an expression I could not fully read, but recognized as the beginning of something. Not the end of something. The beginning. Sandra was very still. I folded my hands on the table and looked at the front of the room. 30 years ago, I gave him a passing grade. Today, I gave him something else entirely. Judge Chen did not move immediately to the next matter after I sat down. She looked at Franklin for a measured moment, the kind of look that carries professional weight without requiring words to deliver it. Then she said that in light of the information presented regarding Petitioner's Counsel's academic record, she was noting a potential conflict of interest for separate review and would be forwarding the relevant documentation to the Virginia State Bar's Office of Professional Conduct following the conclusion of today's proceedings. She said it the way she might note a filing deadline, factual, unhurried, final. Franklin said, "Your Honor, I would like to be heard on that matter." Judge Chen said, "You'll have that opportunity through the appropriate channel, Mr. Webb, not here." She looked down at her file. "Miss Sutton, does respondent have additional submissions?" Claire said there was one final exhibit. She looked at Margaret. Margaret rose from the witness stand for the last time that morning. She approached the clerk's table, submitted a document, and waited while copies were distributed. When the copy reached our table, I did not look at it. I already knew what it contained. I had known since the evening Edward showed it to me a quiet Tuesday in late autumn, 3 years before he became ill. When he had spread the pages across the dining room table and walked me through each clause with the patience of a man who understood that the most important conversations are the ones you have before they become necessary. Margaret addressed the bench. She explained that Edward Whitfield, 14 months before his passing, had executed a formal gift agreement with the Fine Arts Institution on the Boulevard, a transfer of the complete art collection held at the Monument Avenue residence to take effect upon his death. The agreement had been drawn by an independent estate attorney, witnessed by 2 parties unconnected to the family, and registered with the City of Richmond's records office at the time of execution. She paused, then noted the specific clause Edward had insisted upon. In the event that any legal proceeding was initiated that named Dorothy Whitfield as a respondent in a guardianship, conservatorship, or competency matter, the gift agreement would activate an automatic disclosure provision. Every financial record, provenance document, insurance valuation, and correspondence related to the collection would be submitted in full to the presiding court. The collection itself, from the moment any such proceeding was filed, would be held in legal trust by the institution, unreachable by any court order, any guardian, any executor, or any party to the proceeding. Edward had not simply given away the collection, he had turned it into a shield. The room was quiet. I watched Sandra. She had been still through most of the morning, controlled, deliberate, the way she always was. But something shifted in the moment after Margaret finished speaking. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the quiet of a person who has just finished a long calculation and arrived at a number they were not expecting. Her eyes moved once down to the table, then to the exhibit, then to a point somewhere beyond the left wall of the courtroom. She did not look at Franklin. She did not look at Daniel. She already understood. There was nothing left to reach for. Whatever the petition might have achieved, whatever the original intent had been, shaped across months of careful planning and quiet coordination, the object of that intent no longer existed in any form that could be taken. Edward had understood, with the particular clarity of a man who loved carefully and planned quietly, exactly what needed to be protected and exactly how to protect it. Judge Chen reviewed the exhibit for 2 full minutes. The courtroom waited. Then she closed the file in front of her. She said the petition for guardianship filed on behalf of Daniel Whitfield was dismissed in its entirety. She said the evidentiary record did not support a finding of cognitive or functional incapacity on the part of the respondent. She said the financial documentation entered by respondent's counsel raised serious questions that warranted separate review, and she was referring those materials to the appropriate oversight bodies. She said that the matter of petitioner's counsel's professional conduct had already been noted for referral. She said all of this in the same even, measured tone she had used since 9 o'clock that morning, without triumph, without censure, simply as a statement of what the evidence required. She asked if there were any final matters from either party. There were none. She closed the session. The sound of the gavel was not loud. It never is, in rooms where the real weight has already been distributed through the words that came before it. I began to gather the papers in front of me. Around me, the room began its ordinary reconfiguration: attorneys speaking to clients, the court reporter removing equipment, the clerks collecting their materials from the bench, the ordinary mechanics of an ending. And then I was aware of someone standing at the edge of my peripheral vision, to my left, slightly behind the aisle that divided the 2 tables. I looked up. Daniel was standing there. He was not close. There was still the full width of the aisle between us, and he had not crossed it. He was simply standing, his jacket still buttoned, his hands at his sides. He was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since the years before Sandra, before the folder, before the slow accumulation of distance that had replaced the son I had raised. He did not say anything. Neither did I. But he held my gaze for a long moment, long enough that it was not accidental, long enough that it carried the full weight of everything that had happened in that room and everything that had not yet been said, and then he gave a single, slow nod. I held his gaze and nodded once in return. Edward had done in silence what I could never have done alone, and now everyone in that room knew it. The hallway outside the courtroom was longer than I remembered it being on the way in. That is the thing about walking into a difficult room. The approach compresses everything, time and distance both, because the mind is occupied with what lies ahead. Walking out is different. The same corridor expands. You notice the afternoon light coming through the tall windows on the east side of the building, the way it falls in long rectangles across the tiled floor. You notice the sound of your own footsteps. You notice that the weight you carried in is not quite the same weight you are carrying out. Margaret walked beside me. Claire was a few steps behind, organizing the last of her materials into her case. We did not speak for the first stretch of the hallway, not from any particular agreement, but because the morning had used a great number of words, and the 3 of us understood, without discussion, that silence was the appropriate transition. We were perhaps 20 feet from the main stairwell when I heard footsteps behind us, different from Claire's measured pace, faster and less certain. I did not need to turn around to know who they belonged to. A mother recognizes her child's gait the way she recognizes his voice. Some things do not change, regardless of how much else does. Daniel said, "Mom, wait." I stopped. Margaret glanced at me once, then said quietly that she would meet me downstairs. Claire followed her without being asked. In a matter of seconds, the hallway held only the 2 of us. Daniel looked the way people look when they have been holding something together through force of will, and the thing they were holding it together for has just ended. His jacket was still buttoned, but the careful composure he had worn all morning had loosened at the edges around the eyes, in the set of his jaw. He said he needed to say something. I said I was listening. He said he was sorry, not for the petition, not yet, not in those terms, but for the distance, for the years of it. He said it had happened gradually, and then it hadn't seemed gradual anymore, and by the time he understood how far he had moved, he did not know how to move back. He said this looking at a point slightly past my left shoulder, the way people look when they are saying something true that they have not rehearsed. I did not fill the silence that followed. I let it sit. Then I told him that I had heard him. I told him that hearing him was not the same as resolving anything, and that I would not pretend it was. I told him that what he had just come through, what we had both just come through, was not a small thing, and that small words in a courthouse hallway were not sufficient to contain it. I told him to go home, to think, to call me in a few days, when he had had time to decide what he actually wanted, rather than what the morning's events had made him feel. He nodded. He looked for a moment, exactly like the boy who used to sit at the kitchen table doing homework while I graded papers nearby, present, uncertain, waiting for direction. Then he turned and walked back down the hallway. 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, he knocked at the front door. I had been expecting the call, not the visit. I opened the door and stepped back to let him in without ceremony. He came inside, looked briefly at the front room, the familiar arrangement of furniture, the afternoon settling into the corners, and followed me to the kitchen table, where I had been working through a stack of correspondence that had accumulated during the weeks of preparation. I made 2 cups of coffee. He sat down. We were quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are deciding where to begin. He began honestly. That much I will say for him. He did not open with excuses or with the kind of context that is designed to soften what comes after it. He said that he had known earlier than he had ever admitted that Sandra's interest in the house had moved beyond concern into something more deliberate. He said he had told himself, for longer than he should have, that he was managing it, that he could keep it from becoming what it became. He said he had been wrong. He said he had not known about the account, the transfers, the offshore arrangement, the coordination with Franklin. None of that had been shared with him. He said that when he saw the exhibit in the courtroom, the timeline laid against the dates he recognized, something had settled into place that had been shifting beneath him for months without his fully understanding what it was. I listened to all of it. When he finished, I set my cup down and spoke carefully. I told him that I believed the part about the account. I also told him that not knowing about one thing did not erase the knowledge he had chosen to set aside about everything else. That silence, when it protects the wrong person, is its own kind of decision. That a grown man who had been raised to understand the difference between being led and choosing to follow had, for 3 years, chosen to follow. I told him that I was not prepared to tell him what that meant for us yet. That rebuilding something requires more than a single honest afternoon. That I needed to see who he was going to be now, not who he said he was going to be. That the door was not closed, but it was not open all the way either. He sat with that for a long time. He did not argue. He did not negotiate. He simply sat, his hands wrapped around the cup I had given him, looking at the table. Then he looked up at me and opened his mouth. He said, "Mom," and couldn't finish. I waited. Because some words need space before they can mean anything again. 2 weeks after the hearing, Margaret called and said she was taking me to breakfast. She did not ask. That was characteristic of her, Andy Ambeland, Andy A. Diaz, MD, Andy A. Bervon Mandier. That was characteristic of her, the particular brand of care that does not pause to inquire whether care is wanted. She named a place on West Carey Street, a small establishment she had been going to for years, the kind that does not advertise and does not need to. She said to be ready by 8:30. I was. We sat by the window. The morning was mild for late October, the kind of day Richmond produces occasionally in autumn, as if offering a reminder of what it is capable of before the cold fully arrives. We ordered without looking at the menu. Margaret knew what she wanted, and I found I did too, which struck me as a small but meaningful sign that something in me was recalibrating. We talked for nearly 2 hours, not about the case that chapter had closed, and neither of us had any interest in reopening it over eggs and coffee. We talked about other things. Her daughter's acceptance into a graduate program in public health. A book we had both read years apart and were only now discovering we had both read. The particular exhaustion that follows a long effort when the effort is finally done, and the strange lightness that comes after the exhaustion lifts. At some point, Margaret set down her cup and said, quietly, that she was grateful that the outcome could have gone differently, and that she did not take for granted the way it had gone. She said she believed in a grace that operates beyond what any of us can fully plan for. I told her I had been thinking the same thing, that there had been moments in the past 11 months when the only way I had kept moving was the quiet conviction that I was not carrying it entirely alone, that God had a hand in the shape of things, even the things that looked, from the outside, like nothing more than paperwork and preparation. She smiled at that. We finished our coffee and left a generous tip for the young woman who had refilled our cups 3 times without being asked. The Virginia Museum of Fine Arts sits on the boulevard in a way that has always struck me as deliberate, not simply occupying its space but anchoring it, the way certain buildings seem designed to remind the city they are part of, that some things are built to last. I had made an appointment the week before with the curator who oversaw the Whitfield collection, a title that still felt unfamiliar to me, though I was slowly coming to understand that unfamiliarity was not the same as unwelcome. Her name was Dr. Renata Okafor, a composed woman in her early 40s with a precise manner and an evident respect for the work in her care. She met me in a room adjacent to the main gallery, where the collection was being prepared for a permanent installation. She showed me the floor plan, 12 pieces, arranged across 2 connecting rooms, each one placed according to a light study Edward had commissioned himself, specifying in his correspondence with the museum exactly how he wanted the afternoon sun to move across each canvas. She handed me a folder containing his letters to the curatorial team, 6 letters, written over the course of 18 months. Detailed, thoughtful, entirely characteristic of the man who had once spent 3 weeks researching the right wood for a bookcase because he wanted it to last. I read portions of the letters standing at the display table, and I understood for the first time with the full weight of comprehension that Edward had not simply decided to give the collection away. He had spent the last years of his life designing its future. He had corresponded with these people. He had visited this building. He had walked these rooms and decided where each piece would live. He had been building something while I thought he was simply living. I thanked Dr. Okafor for her time and for the care she and her team had given to his vision. She said it had been an honor. She said Edward had been exceptionally clear about his intentions, that the collection was meant to be shared, that great things lose something essential when they are held too tightly by too few people. She said he had written that in his final letter. I stood in the doorway of the first gallery for a moment before leaving. The afternoon light was beginning to come through the high windows the way Edward had planned for it to come. I said a quiet thank you, not to the room, not to the collection, but upward, in the way you direct gratitude when you understand that the person you want to thank is no longer reachable by ordinary means, but you believe, with the certainty that comes from a long life and a faithful one, that it lands somewhere. The following week, I returned to the University of Richmond, not as a petitioner, not as a subject of concern, as myself. A colleague in the law faculty had reached out 2 months prior, asking whether I would consider joining an advisory panel for the elder law clinic the school had recently expanded. I had set the message aside during the weeks of preparation. Now I responded. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. The students in the clinic were earnest and sharp and full of the particular energy that comes from people who have not yet been worn down by the gap between what the law says and what it does. I found myself speaking with a fluency I had not expected, drawing on cases, on patterns, on 35 years of watching people navigate systems that were not built with them in mind. Afterward, walking back to my car across the campus I had crossed thousands of times over 4 decades, I felt something settle into place that had been slightly off its foundation for longer than I had realized. Not happiness exactly, something quieter and more durable than happiness. The sense that I was standing on ground that was mine, doing work that was mine, in a life that, despite everything that had been aimed at it, was still intact. I looked up at the sky above the tree line, the particular shade of blue that Richmond produces in late autumn, clean and deep, and I thought, thank you. Simply that. No elaboration. The kind of gratitude that does not need to be explained to the one it is directed toward. I got in my car and drove home. On the way, I thought about Edward, about the letters in that folder, about the floor plan with the light study, about the 18 months he had spent corresponding with a museum curator while going about his life in a way that gave no indication of the scope of what he was arranging. He had loved me in ways I was still discovering, and I had spent 30 years only seeing half of it. November came to Richmond the way it always does, without announcement, without ceremony, simply arriving one morning in the quality of the light and the stillness of the air before the city wakes. I had been sitting on the front porch since just after 7. The elm trees along the sidewalk were holding their last few leaves, with the patient resignation of things that know what is coming and have made their peace with it. A neighbor 2 houses down walked her dog past the iron fence, raised a hand in greeting, and kept moving. I raised mine in return. These small exchanges, unhurried, unremarkable, were among the things I had missed most during the months when my attention had been required elsewhere. I had a cup of tea on the railing beside me, barely touched. Some mornings are for drinking tea, and some are for simply holding it, letting the warmth move through your hands while you think about nothing in particular and everything at once. This was the second kind. 3 months had passed since the hearing. The legal proceedings referred for further review were ongoing. I had no involvement in them and sought none. Franklin had retained separate counsel. Sandra had, by all accounts, left Richmond. Daniel had told me this in a matter-of-fact tone that carried more beneath it than he put into words, and I had listened the same way. The house was still mine. The street was still the same street. And I found, sitting there in the early November quiet, that I did not need it to be anything more than that. Margaret arrived just before 10, carrying a paper bag from a bakery on Strawberry Street she had been going to for years. She came up the porch steps without knocking, which was correct, because knocking had never been necessary between us, and sat in the chair beside mine. We did not need much conversation. That is one of the gifts of a long friendship, the ability to occupy the same space without filling it. We ate what she had brought. A cardinal settled briefly on the porch railing, regarded us with the mild suspicion that cardinals reserve for people sitting too still, and departed. Margaret said, "I think that bird knows something." I said, "Most birds do." Before she left, she put her hand over mine and said she was glad for how things had gone. Not triumphant, just glad. The quiet, durable kind of gladness that belongs to people who have seen enough to know that things do not always go this way, and that when they do, the right response is not celebration, but gratitude. I told her I felt the same. Daniel came on Sunday, as he had the 2 Sundays before. This had become the shape of things between us, not restored to what we had been, because that time was not returnable, but building towards something new, something honest. He arrived at 11, helped himself to coffee in the kitchen the way he had since he was old enough to reach the cabinet, and came out to the porch where I was reading. We talked for 2 hours, about his work, about a trip he was considering, about the elder law clinic at the university. He listened with the kind of attention that tells you a person is actually present, not simply waiting for their turn to speak. It was not a perfect Sunday. There were moments of careful navigation, places where the conversation moved slightly around something rather than through it, the way a path accommodates a tree that has been there long enough to become part of the road. We were learning the shape of this new arrangement. That takes time. I have never been impatient with things that take time. When he stood to leave, he paused at the top of the porch steps and looked back at me. He said, "Same time next Sunday?" I said, "I'll have the coffee ready." He smiled just briefly, just enough, and went down the steps. "Before I go, I want to ask you something. If you were sitting where I am right now on this porch, looking back at everything that had been aimed at you and everything that had held, what would you have done about Daniel? Would you have opened that door, slowly and with conditions, the way I did? Or would you have decided that some distances, once traveled, cannot be closed? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you are watching from somewhere in this country or beyond it, leave your city and your state below. There is something about knowing who is listening that makes the telling feel worthwhile. I have been asked more than once since all of this whether I was frightened. The honest answer is yes, not of losing the house, but of what it meant that the people who stood to gain from taking it were people I had loved. That kind of fear does not announce itself. It settles in quietly, the way cold moves into an old house through the gaps you did not know were there. But I had been trained, over the course of a long career, to read what is actually on the page, not what someone hopes you will see, not what the language is designed to suggest, what the words, examined carefully, actually say. That training did not leave me when I retired. It had simply been waiting for the moment it was needed most. They came in with a plan. They had lawyers, documents, arranged assessments, and a narrative built over months. What they had not accounted for, what people who underestimate a quiet woman in her 70s rarely account for, was that I had been building my own structure, in my own time, long before they ever slid anything across my table. The most dangerous person in any room is the one they forgot to watch.